I want to start by acknowledging the missing comma after Austin in my very first slide. And I want to assure all of you that that probably won't be the only mistake. I'd like to thank the organizers, Tim, Adi, and Sharon, for the work of making political concepts, and everyone here for making it happen. It's a pleasure to be here. Yesterday was great, and I'm looking forward to the discussions today. Okay. So my concept is performative or performativity, a term from J.L. Austin's How to Do Things with Words, a contribution to ordinary language philosophy in the form of lectures given in the 1950s, then published as a book with that title in 1962. It's remarkable to me how the meaning of performativity has changed in the last 20 to 30 years, from the mid-20th century to the turn to the 21st. Performativity signaled the inaugural or creative powers of language. It careened between ritualized repetitive utterance on the one hand and the innovation and subversion of speech acts or resignification on the other. Nowadays, though, performativity signifies hypocrisy or pretense, as in, that's so performative. This means performativity has become all theater, no speech act theory, or deconstruction, collapsing into just one branch of what Eve Sedgwick has called its dual history. And once you're in theater, of course, you easily slide into mere or fake or insincere. Not that that's correct to do that, but it's easier. At more or less the same time during that same 30-year period, a possibly parallel but certainly distinct and more interesting shift in the meaning of performativity happens in the work of Judith Butler, a move from language to bodies, or more specifically from the languaged body to embodiment in and beyond language. What I want to do today is ask whether we lost anything in the second shift, and whether the shift necessitated, theoretically speaking, a turn away from Austin, and whether we might have lost something valuable in turning away from Austin. So I'll briefly, very schematically, I had to take out so many quotes because I can't get it all in 30 minutes, track the performativity's permutations through the work of Judith Butler and Eve Sedgwick, both working in queer theory, and in the 90s, both authors of articles about queer performativity, which appeared together in the inaugural issue of GLQ in 1993. I'll then turn to J.L. Austin and argue for the importance of reading Austin, not through Shoshana Fellman's work, which I admire, but which misleads. And Fellman's work is arguably the frame for both Butler and Sedgwick, though Butler also draws on Derrida and Derrida's Austin and Kafka. I'll argue that there is a queer performativity to be found in Austin, that is to say that he's less in need of queering than was thought to be the case in the 90s. I'll then turn to Hannah Arendt, who theorized political action as word and speech, which is to say as performative. And I've made that argument before. I'll acknowledge right now that this is not a word that she uses, and Austin never appears in her archive either. So having acknowledged that, I'll now make the case for it anyway. So here we go. Butler. Butler has theorized performativity since the late 80s and through the 90s. They first treat performativity as a site of symbolic resignification that resexes and regenders the sex-gendered body daily, bringing it into normative conformity, or not, over and over again. In this strand of Butler's work, the work is oriented mostly by examples of speech acts and word use, discursive formations. The arbitrariness of the sign, its non-expressive relation to the bodies shaped by signification, and its non-referentiality are key to a possibly subversive performative politics of sex-gender opposed to the identity politics of feminism, Butler argues. In a 1994 interview with Radical Philosophy, Butler says, quote, "It is important to understand performativity, which is distinct from performance, through the more limited notion of resignification," unquote. Then later, predominantly after the year 2000, Butler treats performativity as a site at which language runs out or meets its limit. Examples here are of bodies, sometimes dead bodies, other times alive and gathered together, with impacts that register above or below language. So I don't have time to read all these quotes, but each one is just a sample from a 92, 93, 97 publication, each of which treats performativity in this more discourse-oriented way that I've described. The last on the slide is from Performative Theory of Assembly, and that is where Butler says, quote, embodied actions signify in ways that are strictly speaking neither discursive nor prediscursive. So moving in the direction of the body beyond language. I want to be clear that my point here is not that there's a contradiction in the overall argument, but just that what counts as performative shifts. Okay, here's another slide that just lists the articles and books I'll be referring to now. Performativity in this first discursive sense is the dominant thread through the 90s. It is notable, though, that in both strands of performativity, this one that I've described in more detail and the one that is focused more on the body, in both of those strands of Butler's arguments, J.L. Austin is either not present or not central to Butler's thinking. Contra Sarah Salih and Zeynep Gambetti and many others who see performativity, the word, and assume, reasonably enough, the presence or influence of Austin, he is not there. In the December 1988 article, Performative Acts, Butler cites only John Searle, a follower of Austin, and this only to dismiss Searle immediately in the first paragraph, which is fine with me. In Gender Trouble and after, the points of departure on performativity are Nietzsche, no doer behind the deed, Beauvoir, the body is a situation, Foucault, power is productive, Althusser, language is interpolative, and Derrida, performativity is citational and also ruptural. Still no Austin. It's only in 1933 that Butler turned to Austin, and then only briefly, and later in more detail in 97. Asked why they turned to Austin in the 1997 book Excitable Speech, Butler says in a 1999 interview with Vicki Bell, I suppose the use of Austin became important because, you know, it's a theory of the performative, and this is a word I've been using all along without quite dealing with him, which has already been somewhat scandalous. I think in Gender Trouble, I actually took it from Derrida's essay on Kafka before the law, which had Austin as its background, but which I didn't bother to pursue. In any case, Butler makes clear now that they have turned to Austin, theirs is, quote, not a loyal use of Austin. Austin gives us a fantasy, they say. He charts without knowing it, a fantasy of sovereign power in speech. I love the without knowing it in the middle of the sovereign subject. Now, scandalous is an interesting word to use in this context, since Butler will in 2002 attribute their turn to the body to Shoshana Fellman's The Scandal of the Speaking Body. This is in their afterword to the republication of Fellman's book from 1980. But in this 1999 interview, Butler doesn't mention Fellman. There's nothing scandalous about that. Things just move in a different direction in the interview. Eve Sedgwick is also not mentioned, and this only matters because I think her work may actually have been what prodded Butler's first turn to Austin. Sedgwick begins her 1993 critique of Butler, called Queer Performativity, with Austin. Quote, I don't remember hearing the phrase queer performativity used before, Sedgwick said, but it seems to be made necessary by, if nothing else, the work of Judith Butler, in since her important book, Gender Trouble, unquote. So this is how Sedgwick introduces her own turn to Austin. Sedgwick claims that Austin develops the idea of performative utterances by treating the I-do of the straight couple as exemplary in how to do things with words. The I-do is not only his first example, it's also one to which he returns repeatedly, and the result is a rather partial and homophobic kind of performativity right there at the source. Sedgwick intimates that the problem is larger than Austin, since performativity is now a key term also for Butler. It's left intimated. Citing and following Fellman's Scandal of the Speaking Body, Sedgwick jokes rather famously that, quote, the marriage ceremony is indeed so central to the origins of Austin's performativity that a more accurate name for how to do things with words might have been how to say or write I do about 20 million times without winding up any more married than when you started out, unquote. Now, Butler fends off the critique of their own politics of performativity, partly by noting exactly what Fellman has just joked about, which is that the wedding doesn't always work. The I do can fail. And argues for the productivity, Butler does, of performative failures and for the promise of resignification as a critically queer, that's the name of their article, critically queer practice. But still, Butler largely accepts Sedgwick's Fellmanian reading of Austen and of Austinian performatives as centrally modeled on marriage and as sovereignty installing. The I do installs the sovereign I, Fellman says, and Sedgwick and Butler agree. So here you see them saying subject as sovereign is presumed in the Austinian account of performativity, and so on, from Excitable Speech, that's 1997. Sedgwick went on to argue, though, now moving beyond Fellman, that Austen's performative I do did not only marry a couple and install a sovereign straight I, but that it also, and now moving beyond Fellman, shamed and minoritized queer forms of living, then excluded, 1993, from the legitimation of state-sanctioned marriage. There was no untethering the marrying from the shaming. And so Sedgwick proposed a supplement to Austen, partitioning different kinds of speech acts, performatives, from others. Some performatives belong to Austen's category, but others, she proposed, should be called deformatives. And she proposed that the I do, the exemplary performative in Austen, should be replaced with one such deformative, in particular, shame on you, which would performatively, what would performativity look like if shame on you replaced the I do? The exemplary performative would then be one that dispensed entirely with the I, there is no I in shame on you, while also naming a constitutive experience of queerness, which is stigmatization. What if speech act theory performatives were built on shame on you rather than the I do, Sedgwick asks. And here you'll see on one side Heather Love summarizing this point that I've just made about Sedgwick, and also Sedgwick's line about how she's struck by the nature of Austen's performative examples. So she says, we can speculate about different versions of performativity. Okay, go ahead and call them perversions or deformatives that might begin by placing some different kinds of utterance in the position of the exemplary. Austen keeps going back to that first person, singular, present, indicative, active. And the marriage example, why does he keep going back to those? It makes me wonder about the apparently natural way the first person speaking, acting, and pointing subject, like the present, like the wedding present, itself gets constituted in marriage and through a confident appeal to state authority and those who act as witnesses and the logic of the heterosexual supplement, all of which guarantee subjectivity by welding the subject to the cross-gender dyad. Then she says, quote, persons who self-identify as queer by contrast will be those whose subjectivity is lodged in refusals or deflections of or by the logic of the heterosexual supplement, in far less simple associations attaching to state authority, in far less complacent relations to the witness of others. The emergence of the first person, of the singular, of the present, I'm sorry, I thought I had already gone to this, but everything I'm stressing is in orange, of the active and the indicative are all questions rather than presumptions, are all questions rather than presumptions for queer performativity. There is all the same, though, Sedgwick says, something queer about performativity. Performativity is already quite a queer category, she says, but this is maybe not so surprising given its mongrel crew of deployers from Leotard to Hillis Miller to Damon with no clear genealogy. But it's also queer for another reason, she says, because of the tenuousness of its ontological ground, the fact that it begins its intellectual career all but repudiated in advance by its originator, J.L. Austen, who introduces the term in the 1955 Harvard Lectures, only to disown it somewhere around the 8th, unquote. So it's a Frankenstein of a concept then, spurned by incidenter and possibly bent on revenge. Performativity is dreamed into a short, tragic existence by Austen, who, finding his original distinction between performative and constitutive utterance ultimately unsustainable, confesses that performativity takes over everything, wiping out the distinction between doing and describing that he had tried to secure. So it's a monster. In keeping with retellings of Mary Shelley's story and with Derrida's view of performative richness as iterable utterance, this Frankenstein doesn't necessarily call to be abandoned or spurned. Of course, there are rewritings of Frankenstein in which the relationship becomes more sentimental between inventor and spurned monster. But this is where we're left for the moment. Sedgwick and Butler both find Austen's I do to be injuriously heteronormative in its promotion of the sovereign I. But other readers of Austen are more open. Stanley Cavell embraces Austen's I do. It enmeshes the I in relationality, he says, modeling a reconciliation that is necessary but politically elusive in the US. Commenting on Cavell, Imani Perry in turn agrees with the various critiques of Austinian sovereignty, but finds an important Austinian alternative in the, quote, disorders of desire that Cavell will introduce when he adds passionate utterance to Austen's repertoire of performativity. Everyone thinks Austen left something out, and everyone nominates like an extra deformative, passionate utterance. There's a lot of that. So Cavell, too, like Sedgwick, is adding to Austen to counterbalance a limitation in Austen's notion of performativity. But all these readings, pro and contra, are upended once we attend to a neglected detail in Austen's How to Do Things with Words. Beginning on page 33 of How to Do Things with Words, Austen commences a nearly book-length thread. I'm sorry, I'm just checking my time. Okay, it's good. Beginning on page 33 of How to Do Things with Words, Austen commences a nearly book-length thread on a bull. Austen's critics and admirers position themselves differently around the I do and its installation supposedly of sovereign subjectivity, but none mentions Austen's bull, even though Austen's mentions of the animal rival the frequency that Sedgwick says is the justification for her focus on the conjugal vow. But where the I do marries a couple, Austen's bull will gather and disperse a crowd. These two, the couple and the crowd, are paired in Don Pedro's bromide to Benedick in Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing, quote, "In time, the savage bull doth bear the yoke," unquote. The bull and the yoke are the desire in marriage that are, I want to argue, the twin pillars of Austen's How to Do Things with Words. We don't need Shakespeare to make the point. Google, too, provides. When I Google the phrase, "the bull represents extraconjugal desire," a phrase from the larger draft of this paper, just making sure that I haven't been repeating something someone else has already said, my search engine is then swarmed by links to cuckoldry, many of them how-tos, and my laptop's search is forced out of its safe mode, which I didn't know I had, and apparently in keeping with Austen's bull, which moves us out of safe mode as well. When Austen first says there is a bull in the field, he seems only interested in asking whether it is a descriptive or a performative utterance. And the answer is, it depends on how it's said, whether there's a danger imminent, and so on. But later, just before returning to the bull, who may now be about to charge, Austen discusses the utterance John is running. 8 pages later, on page 62, we see a signed memorandum from John. I call it a legalish document, it's not really legal, in which John Jones asserts this bull is dangerous. This makes the earlier John is running very funny, but it also suggests a pairing where the couple has the marital contract that yokes savage desire. The bull is marked by a legal warning, a signed memorandum from John. That's what it looks like on the page. Warning of the danger. Austen's turn here to legal documentation is less about containing the bull than it is about mocking legal and philosophical efforts to contain the uncontainable, calling to my mind Melville's discussion of loose and fast fish in Moby Dick, also making a mockery of the law. Later, Austen, without mentioning the bull, turns to ponder the truth or falsity of an utterance like "it is going to charge." Other warnings or distinctions strewn throughout the book trigger thoughts of the bull without mentioning him by name. In all of them, the question is suggested: will the crowd gather to marvel? Will it dispense in time? The bull is a magnetizing force representing both desire, Cavell's passion, and performativity. And I note that Sedgwick says about performativity in that 1993 essay that it exerts on her, quote, a certain magnetism, unquote. In sum, Sedgwick sets out to critically transform how to do things with words for queer theory, but I think queerness is already there, and not just in the way she herself suggests: the spurning father, the multiply made kinships of citationality, and the magnetism, all elements of the Frankenstein motif. The bull thread in Austen shows a more wayward, less sovereign, queerer, and less stigmatizing view of performativity than previously thought. We can sign all the memoranda we like and post them on fence posts, and possibly pass them in state legislatures, but Austen shows they will fall off the fence long before the bull gives up its fight to be free of enclosure. There is a bull in the field as an utterance that has the power to gather a crowd, curious to observe, as well as the power to disperse a crowd, fearing the danger. Austen moves from couple to crowd by way of the bull. If Fellman is, as she says, seduced by Austen, she somehow neglects this scene of seduction. What else to call it when, in spite of the danger, people seem to want to cluster round, and why they persist even though John has posted the legalish warning to keep them away. Good? Okay. You all look so skeptical. It's a concepts thing. We can trace the displacement of couple by crowd also in the work of Hannah Arendt, who I was reading as a theorist of performativity in the late 80s and early 90s, at the same moment that Butler and Sedgwick were assessing the stakes of the performative for queer theory. Arendt names promising and forgiveness as the two precepts of political action. Both are performatives, but she doesn't use the word performativity, as I mentioned, and she doesn't cite Austen. And so for now, she's not in the performativity archive. I think she should be. Promising and forgiveness create, by way of word and deed, what Arendt called new relations and realities. But in Arendt, they do not create a sovereign I. Arendtian action is non-sovereign. She thinks sovereignty has wrongly displaced the experience of freedom in modernity. For her, forgiveness is a discrete action, risking proximity to the sovereignty installing brand of performativity. But it is also, at the same time, a more Nietzschean process of, quote, constant mutual release, unquote. The combination is a way to show how a performative that could install a sovereign I can also be worked against sovereignty. Now, Arendt is also able to provide performativity with something that Butler in 2004's Undoing Gender says worried that performativity lacked, which is to say norms to guide what might otherwise be a formal practice of resignification, excuse me. The missing norms, Butler said, would have to be derived from a radical democratic theory and practice. One lived politically in relationship to power. And I think the missing normativity is in the crowd in Austen and its indifference to legality and enclosure. That's one kind of anarchic normativity. But it's also there in Arendt when she talks about action in concert among equals. There's normativity there to guide a politics. Now, notably, when Arendt talks about action in concert, she too takes up a bull thread, we could say, and she too trades couple for crowd. She would have us depart from the reproducing couple of labor and the pair of seller and buyer of work to access the domain of action, which is a world of collective performative possibility with others in their plurality, a crowd. And sure enough, here, a bull surfaces in a passing joke of Arendt's about the reality-denying ethos of the Epicureans. She says, just as Epicureanism rests on the illusion of happiness when one is roasted alive in the phaleric bull, Stoicism rests on the illusion of freedom when one is enslaved. Now, the phaleric bull, which I've quickly become expert on, is perhaps mythic, perhaps true, not clear, but was understood to be a torture device, hollow, made of metal, and the victim would be thrown into the bull and a fire would be lit beneath it, and the person inside would be roasted to a gruesome death inside what was in effect an oven. The bull, though, had a tantalizing feature. Pipes and reeds near its nostrils turned the agonized screams of the tortured into pleasurable sounding music. That's one view. Another is that maybe it gave off a sound that sounded like what a real bull would sound like. In the phaleric bull, cries of anguish became music. Some say that this was done so that the king did not have to suffer the pleas of his victims for mercy, but that would assume that he would care. There's some resonance, to my mind, between this bull and what Saidiya Hartman sees in the coffle in the scenes of subjection. The disavowal of the captive's pain through forced song and dance, and the use of the body as an instrument against the self. Where the enslaved resisted at times by turning the ordered song ordered by a master that they should sing it on the way to the market to be sold and to be separated from their kin, when the enslaved sometimes resisted by turning the ordered song into a dirge, the phaleric bull does the work of dampening the anguish with a cover of song. The phaleric bull, which makes music of suffering, shifting from, as Hartman says, despair to enjoyment, returns us to Arendt, whose favorite performative, if I may put it that way, is We Hold, the We Hold of the US Declaration of Independence, about which Derrida wrote too, and I have a detailed account of how to read them together in other work of mine. For today, let me end with this. The We Hold, Arendt's We Hold, is not just a performative music, but also a deformative anguish. And what the move that I'm making here is contra Sedgwick, rather than say there are some performatives and then there's this other class called deformatives. I'm suggesting that what Sedgwick helps us see is how we may think of performatives as harboring deformatives, how deformativity might be the seamy underside of a performative and not just a separate class. The We Hold brings a people into being with great promises for all, and then licenses a planter's constitution. The normative orientation of this performative, must include the anguish of Frederick Douglass's What to the Slave is the 4th of July. Arendt and many more couldn't hear Douglass because the music and fireworks were for so long so loud that they drowned him out. So here I'm suggesting again that Sedgwick's deformatives can be the seamy undersides of performativity, and in many instances, those performatives may harbor in themselves this different utterance, the different utterance of the not you. The shame on you is a not you. The I do is a not you. The not you that has been historically constituted in law and practice by would-be universalisms like We Hold. Now, Austin teaches that where there's a couple, there's a crowd, and vice versa. But the performative's possible violence or imperfection, I'm thinking about what Leela said yesterday, I have more to say about it later, but the performative's possible violence or imperfection is, to my mind, not a reason to give up on a politics of performativity in the original, more language body sense, but rather to keep working on it. Thank you.